Bien,
Ya estamos.
sí, gracias a Joseda y Círculo TV. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a una nueva conferencia de la serie hacia una Europa federal. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de tener con nosotros al comandante Ingo Pipers, que hablará sobre la necesidad de una política exterior y de defensa como parte de una federación europea. Él nos hablará de las posibles agresiones exteriores y de las amenazas internas que se puedan presentar en Europa y cómo se podrían afrontar. También hablará del peso geopolítico que Europa debe tener a nivel planetario. Good evening and welcome to a new conference in the series Towards a Federal Europe. Today we have the privilege of having with us Commander Ingo Pipers, who will speak about the need for a European foreign and defense policy as part of a European federation. He will talk about the possible external aggressions and the internal threats presented to Europe and how they could be confronted. Also, he will talk on the geopolitical weight that Europe should have on a planetary level. Pero antes de comenzar, permítanme presentar al ponente. El doctor Ingo Pipers fue comandante de la unidad marina holandesa que formaba parte de la Fuerza de Intervención Rápida de la ONU durante la Guerra de los Balcanes en el 1995. Ingo estudió Relaciones Internacionales y Seguridad en el Real Colegio Naval de los Países Bajos y se doctoró sobre el estudio de la dinámica de la guerra y el desarrollo de crisis sistémicas internacionales en la Universidad de Ámsterdam en el 2006. Posteriormente, este tema lo ha desarrollado con mayor profundidad, siendo fundador de Global Forecast y autor de múltiples publicaciones sobre la comprensión de la guerra, sus dinámicas e impacto social. Now, let me introduce the speaker to the English audience. There is a sound.
Since we have some echo, yeah.
Okay, that's better. Well, let me introduce the speaker to the English audience. Dr. Ingo Pipers was commander of the Dutch Marine Unit that was part of the UN Rapid Intervention Force during the Balkan War in 1995. Ingo studied international relations and security at the Royal Navy College of Holland and obtained a PhD on the study of the dynamics of war and the development of international systemic crises at the University of Amsterdam in 2006. Later, he developed this subject in greater depth, being founder of Global Cast and the author of multiple publications on the understanding of war, its dynamics, and social impact. Well, and without further ado, we give the floor to the speaker. Ingo, go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Manuel. I will start with my lecture. On the initiative of the Federal Alliance of European Federalists, a 10-article democratic federal constitution for Europe has been drafted to replace the treaties of the European Union. Not only will this constitution guarantee democracy and the unique identity of its member states and communities, but the states that are members of this federation will also be better able to safeguard their values and interests. Dear viewers, my name is Ingo Pipers. I will give a lecture on the need for a European foreign and defense policy and a fully fledged European defense to support it as part of a European federation. This is a vital step that we must take now. As you have probably noticed, Europe is still weak and dependent, as the Russian aggression in Eastern Europe makes painfully clear.
Bueno, podemos simplemente pasar a la traducción. Ingo se refiere a que, bueno, por iniciativa de la Alianza de Federalistas Europeos, que fue liderada por el profesor Leo Klingers, se redactó una Constitución Federal Democrática para Europa de 10 artículos para reemplazar los tratados de la Unión Europea. Esta Constitución no solo garantizará la democracia y la identidad única de sus Estados miembros y comunidades, sino que los Estados que son miembros de esa federación también podrán salvaguardar mejor sus valores e intereses. Estimados espectadores, mi nombre es Ingo Piepers. Daré una conferencia sobre la necesidad de una política exterior y de defensa europea y una defensa europea completa para apoyarla como parte de una federación europea. Esto es un paso vital que debemos dar ahora. Como probablemente habrán notado nuevamente, Europa sigue siendo actualmente débil y dependiente, como ha dejado dolorosamente claro la última guerra entre Rusia y Ucrania en Europa del Este.
There are several reasons why a further upscaling of Europe into a federation is not only logical, but also necessary. Research into the formation of states in Europe, a process that started more than 500 years ago and gained momentum around 1500, shows that social units are constantly growing. However, this natural growth process does not proceed gradually, but with shifts and shocks. Wars were and still are instrumental in this process. Around 1500, Europe still consisted of about 300 small, diverse and loosely connected political units. In 1939, there were only 25 sovereign states, which were highly dependent on each other.
Hay varias razones por las que una mayor conversión de Europa en una federación no solo es lógica, sino también necesaria. La investigación sobre la formación de estados en Europa es un proceso que comenzó hace más de 500 años y cobró impulso alrededor de 1500. Esta formación de los estados muestra que las unidades sociales están en constante crecimiento. Sin embargo, este proceso de crecimiento natural no avanza gradualmente, sino con cambios y sacudidas. Las guerras fueron y siguen siendo fundamentales en este proceso. Existen alrededor del año 1500, Europa todavía constaba de unas 300 unidades políticas muy pequeñas, diversas y poco conectadas. En 1939 había solo 25 estados soberanos que eran dependientes entre sí.
On the basis of data analysis, it can be established that during the period 1500-1945, the European state system produced 4 accelerating war cycles, which in all 4 cases ended with a systematic crisis and a world war. The last systematic war was the Second World War, which resulted in an upscaling from a European state system to a global state system, and you could say a more or less united Europe, the creation of which was somewhat delayed by the Cold War. The rules of the international order, which is still fundamentally anarchistic, are enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. The now 27 member states of the European Union have enshrined the rules of the Union and their relationships in a series of confusing and sometimes conflicting agreements.
Sobre la base del análisis de datos, se puede establecer que durante el periodo que va de 1500 a 1945, el sistema estatal europeo produjo 4 ciclos de guerra acelerados, que en los 4 casos terminaron con una crisis sistémica y una guerra mundial. La última guerra sistémica fue la Segunda Guerra Mundial, que resultó en un escalamiento de un sistema estatal europeo a un sistema estatal global. Y se podría decir una Europa más o menos unida, cuya creación se retrasó un poco por la Guerra Fría. Las reglas del orden internacional, que sigue siendo fundamentalmente anárquico, están consagradas en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Los ahora 27 Estados miembros de la Unión Europea han consagrado las reglas de la Unión y sus relaciones en una serie de acuerdos confusos y a veces contradictorios.
Recent developments, as well as data analysis to which I just referred, show that the now global state system is again in need of a fundamental reordering, which, if the war cycles repeat, will manifest itself as a systemic crisis. The focus of that crisis and possibly accompanying war will be a new international order, a United Nations 2.0, in which new basic agreements will be laid down that can provide stability for some time. What the underlying values and principles of the UN 2.0 will be decided by the transformation process that has now started. The near collapse of the current international order, succumbing to its own internal contradictions, coincides with the crisis in the European Union, about which other speakers have already explained a few things.
Los recientes desarrollos, así como el análisis de datos a los que se acaba de referir el profesor, muestran que el sistema estatal ahora global nuevamente necesita un reordenamiento fundamental, lo cual, de repetirse los ciclos bélicos, se manifestará como una crisis sistémica. El foco de esa crisis y posiblemente de la guerra que la acompañe será un nuevo orden internacional, una especie de ONU 2.0, en el que se establecerán nuevos acuerdos básicos que proporcionarán estabilidad durante algún tiempo. ¿Cuáles serán los valores y principios subyacentes de la ONU 2.0? Bueno, esto será decidido por el proceso de transformación que ha comenzado ahora. El casi colapso del actual orden internacional, sucumbiendo a sus propias contradicciones internas, coincide con una crisis en la Unión Europea sobre la que otros ponentes ya han explicado algunas cosas.
It is true that it has been mostly business, European politics, as usual so far. But the reality is that Europe is still dependent on the United States for its security and defense. Europe is incapable of guaranteeing its own security and interests, as the war in Ukraine shows. The harrowing situation is also made clear by the defense spending of European countries. Every year, the member states of the European Union spend no less than 220 billion euros on defense. Russia spends only around $70 billion a year. Europe, still divided into sovereign states with a total defense budget of 3 times Russia, is still unable to join forces. The fact that Europe's foreign policy is also fragmented is once again apparent. When it comes to foreign and defense policy, it is still every state for himself, and we then shamelessly appeal to the United States for help.
Es cierto que ha sido sobre todo negocios como siempre hasta ahora, pero la realidad es que Europa sigue dependiendo de Estados Unidos para su seguridad y defensa. Es incapaz de garantizar su propia seguridad e intereses, como demuestra la actual guerra en Ucrania. La angustiosa situación también queda clara por el gasto en defensa de los países europeos. Cada año los Estados miembros de la Unión Europea gastan nada menos que 220.000 millones de dólares en defensa. El gasto de Rusia solo alcanza los 70.000 millones. Esto hace que Europa, aún dividida en estados soberanos, con un presupuesto de defensa total de 3 veces Rusia, no es capaz de unir fuerzas. El hecho de que la política exterior de Europa también esté tan fragmentada, esto es una evidencia. Cuando se trata de política exterior y de defensa, sigue siendo cada estado por sí mismo el que encara las situaciones, y esto hace que al final pues, se apele descaradamente a la intervención de Estados Unidos.
However, this dependence on the United States is not free, and we and the United States do not always have the same interests and values that underpin our societies. That relationship of dependence on the United States gives the United States leverage over Europe. Then it remains to be seen how durable the support from the US to Europe is. When it comes to a direct confrontation between the United States and China, for example, over Taiwan, it will be Asia first for the United States and not Europe first, as was the case during the Second World War. Then Europe is suddenly on its own. That is also the case when we can assume if Trump is re-elected or a politician who holds similar views. That too is a realistic nightmare scenario for this disorganized and still fragmented Europe, at least when it comes to security and defense. We must be prepared for these disturbing and realistic scenarios.
Sin embargo, esta dependencia de los Estados Unidos no es gratuita. Y nosotros y los Estados Unidos no siempre tenemos los mismos intereses y valores que sustentan nuestras sociedades. Esa relación de dependencia con los Estados Unidos le da a los Estados Unidos influencia sobre Europa y entonces queda por ver qué tan duradero es ese apoyo de los Estados Unidos a Europa, especialmente cuando se trata de una confrontación directa, de la posibilidad de una confrontación directa entre Estados Unidos y China. Por ejemplo, sobre Taiwán, será Asia primero para Estados Unidos y no Europa primero, como fue el caso durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Entonces, de repente, Europa se encuentra sola. Ese también es el caso, podemos suponer, si Trump es reelegido o un político que tiene, bueno, o otro político que tenga puntos de vista similares. En ese escenario se puede producir una pesadilla realista para esta Europa desorganizada y aún fragmentada, al menos en lo que respecta a la seguridad y la defensa. Por eso debemos estar preparados para estos escenarios inquietantes y a su vez realistas.
So there are several reasons why we need to organize ourselves in a federal Europe as soon as possible. Our security and a common defense are certainly among them. It can be done better, more efficiently, without annoying dependency relationships, if there is the political will to do so and if the European population is aware of what is now at stake. Russia and China leave nothing to be desired. They strive for a new international order in which the United States can no longer play the prominent role it still has. That is a black scenario for Europe. We must realize that the stakes of this crisis and accompanying war, of which the war in the Ukraine may be the first battle, are the values that underlie the United Nations 2.0. That United Nations 2.0 will determine whether and to what extent our democratic values and our European interests will still matter in the future. I explained that there is a natural growth process towards larger social and political units, that war still plays a role in this process in the anarchistic international system, but that we are ill prepared to safeguard our European values and interests. Europe is much less than the sum of its parts, and we are still unable to complete the European project. However, this crisis can also help us in that respect if we can put an end to European navel gazing.
Hay varias razones por las que necesitamos organizarnos en una Europa federal lo antes posible. Nuestra seguridad y una defensa común se encuentran sin duda entre ellas. Se puede hacer mejor, más eficientemente, sin molestas relaciones de dependencia, siempre que haya voluntad política para hacerlo y si la población europea además es consciente de lo que ahora mismo está en juego. Rusia y China no dejan nada que desear, luchan por un nuevo orden internacional en el que Estados Unidos ya no puede desempeñar el papel destacado que aún ostenta. Ese también es un escenario negro para Europa, ya que debemos darnos cuenta de que lo que está realmente en juego en esta crisis y la guerra que la acompaña, de la cual la guerra en Ucrania puede ser la primera batalla, son los valores que subyacen a una especie de ONU 2.0. ¿Qué ONU 2.0 determinará si nuestros valores democráticos y nuestros intereses europeos siguen siendo importantes y en qué medida? El profesor ha explicado que hay un proceso de crecimiento natural hacia unidades sociales y políticas más grandes, que la guerra todavía juega un papel en este proceso, en el sistema internacional que se mueve ahora mismo en medio de un sistema internacional anarquista, pero que estamos pero que estamos mal preparados para salvaguardar nuestros valores e intereses europeos. Europa es mucho menos que la suma de sus partes y todavía somos incapaces de completar el proyecto europeo. Sin embargo, esta crisis también puede ayudar en este sentido si podemos poner fin a los europeos que no dejan de mirarse el ombligo.
As if this were not enough, to naturally take the step towards a European federation as soon as possible, there is another very serious and urgent reason to unite our powers in a federation. I am now referring to the consequences of climate change, which in itself, quite apart from the systemic crisis that is now thrusting itself upon us, should be a reason to organize ourselves in a European federation. Climate change is a global problem that requires a global approach in the short term. The effects of climate change will also bring even more conflict potential. Europe certainly has a responsibility in this, not only in the cause of climate change, but certainly also in the solving of this existential problem. To achieve this, Europe must be possible to act in unison, not as squabbling European countries, each trying to get the best out of it.
Si no fuese todavía suficiente tomar esos pasos adelante que son necesarios lo antes posible, hay otra razón seria y urgente para unir todos los poderes todos los poderes de los Estados europeos en una federación. Me estoy refiriendo a las consecuencias del cambio climático, que en sí mismo, además de dar pie a una crisis sistémica, genera también una crisis de confianza en la propia Europa. Esto debe ser una razón para para que los propios Estados europeos se organicen en una federación, ya que el cambio climático es un problema global que requiere un acercamiento global en el corto término. Los efectos del cambio climático también traerán además más potenciales conflictos, y Europa tiene seguramente la responsabilidad de no solamente parar las causas del cambio climático, sino también de aportar soluciones a nivel global para este problema. Para alcanzar esto, Europa debe posibilitar la acción en unísono y no partir a los diferentes Estados europeos para poder conseguir una acción única que sea la mejor posible.
I hope that with this short lecture I have made clear that also from a foreign policy and defense point of view and the challenges we face in this area, we now need to organize ourselves as a federation as soon as possible. If we fail to do so, we relegate ourselves to a role of spectator, who must accept the solutions that are then forced upon us. I hope that in this short lecture I have made clear the need for Europe. Also, I'm repeating myself, Europe has become a prosperous community, and it is now important that we take the next step towards a federation to perpetuate that and to take our responsibility in the global community. Thank you for your attention.
Espero haber dejado claro con esta breve conferencia que también desde el punto de vista de la política exterior y la defensa y los desafíos que enfrentamos en este área, ahora necesitamos organizarnos como federación lo antes posible. Si no lo hacemos, nos relegamos a un papel de espectador que debe aceptar las soluciones que otros nos imponen. Espero que en esta breve conferencia haya dejado clara la necesidad de que Europa, también desde el punto de vista de la política exterior y la defensa, y los retos que enfrenta, necesita esta federación. Y bueno, luego ha terminado ya diciendo que Europa se ha convertido en una comunidad próspera, y ahora mismo es importante que demos el siguiente paso hacia esa federación para perpetuar y asumir nuestra responsabilidad en la comunidad global. Gracias por su atención.
Thank you, Ingo, for the great presentation. Now the speaker will be pleased to take on any questions you may have. pasamos a la discusión y el doctor Pipes estará encantado de responder a las preguntas que se planteen. Adelante.
Vale, yo tengo una pregunta. Soy Xavier Echendía.
Sí, Xavier.
Vale. Quería preguntarle, si pensamos que una Europa federal sería una amenaza para lo que es hoy en día la Europa de la Unión Europea. O sea, si esta federación sería un problema para lo que hoy conocemos como la Unión Europea.
Thank you, Xavi. Ingo, Xavier from the Basque Country, he's asking whether the creation of a federal union in Europe is threatening somehow the present European Union.
Sorry, I do not really understand your question. Can you say, what do you want me to clarify exactly?
Yeah, if I repeat this for you, Ingo, is if the creation of a federal Europe will threaten in any way the European Union as it is now.
I think the word threatening is not the right word. I think when you look at the interests of the European countries and people, I think when we are organized in a federation, we are better able, on the one hand, to promote and safeguard our common interests, of which foreign policy and defense is one. On the other hand, a federation leaves much more space, I call it, to develop your own identity and local interests as far as possible. Of course, the European Union as an establishment will maybe feel threatened that they should reorganize into a federation. The European Union as a European player has, of course, a very prominent role. And I can imagine that some interest of the European Union for itself can conflict with that of a federation. But I think it's not about the European Union, it's about the European people and countries. And those interests must be promoted and safeguarded. And I think basically a federation, such an organizational setup, will be better able to achieve this in a democratic way, which is very important, of course.
Yeah, Iván, ¿haces tú la traducción de Ingo?
Sí, bueno, Ingo se ha referido a que sería interesante que Europa pudiera decidir democráticamente ese camino hacia la Europa federal sin tener en cuenta, digamos, las actuales limitaciones que podría tener la Unión Europea y simplemente poniendo el foco en que sean los pueblos de Europa quienes decidan esto. Así que no sería tanto un problema actual ni realmente algo que supusiese una ruptura con la Unión Europea como la conocemos hoy. Simplemente podríamos hablar de un proceso paralelo que llevaría, digamos, a otro tipo de Unión Europea desde una participación democrática.
Exacto, o sea, no se trataría de favorecer a los países tal como están, sino a los propios ciudadanos europeos, es lo que concluye el doctor Pipes. Ingo, tengo una pregunta para ti. Has descrito la guerra como un elemento clave del progreso en la convivencia social. ¿Crees que la guerra en Ucrania favorecerá una mayor integración de Europa, posiblemente bajo la forma de una federación? I translate this for you. You have described the war as a key element of progress in social coexistence. Do you think the war in the Ukraine will favor a greater integration of Europe, wishfully in the form of a federation?
I think that this threat from Russia, which established itself now in Ukraine, will be a force for us for change, because it makes us aware, as I explained in this lecture, that we as Europe are still vulnerable and we are still dependent on the United States. I think that in that respect, this can be helpful. And when you see what this generates, this war in a positive sense, is that defense cooperation within various and between various European countries is being improved. In the Nordic countries, there's more...
Se ha cortado la conexión.
Sorry?
No, yo lo escucho bien. Escuchamos bien, ¿eh?
Sí, parece que va bien. It seems Manuel... I think Manuel is having probably some problems.
Yo escucho bien. Yo escucho bien.
¿Puedes escucharnos, Manuel? Okay, it seems Manuel got freeze, but
Ahora se ha parado todo.
Bueno, quizás en este tiempo en el que Manuel se reconecta, yo tenía otra pregunta y
Sí.
era, bueno, saber cuál va a ser el escenario posguerra, una vez se abra, ojalá lo más pronto posible, una mesa de negociación y Europa tenga que entrar en esa mesa para establecer nuevas relaciones con Rusia, también cómo eso va, digamos, a impactar la actual ola otanista, ¿no?, que se ha movido en Europa a raíz de esta guerra, y cómo el proceso de democratizar la Unión Europea a través de una federación puede, digamos, puede convivir con una organización como la OTAN que, bueno, realmente no tiene la participación y la democracia como una de sus bases en sí. I had, in the meantime, I was just coming in with a question to Ingo related to the post-war scenario in Europe, once negotiations will come, hopefully, soon, and Europe will have to face a new type of relation with Russia, and also to rethink the current wave of getting into NATO power that we see in many countries, like last week in Finland, how this will be tackled, you know, in terms of democratic processes and movements towards a federation, having in mind that now Europe is quite tight or a bit closer to an organization like the NATO, where democratic participation is probably not the main point. I would like to know a bit what is the opinion of Ingo in that scenario.
What I think and hope is that the war in Ukraine, however it ends, makes us in Europe, the member states of the European Union, much more aware of our own vulnerabilities and the need that we can operate as Europe with our own interests independently of the United States and face a threat from Russia in the future independently. Of course, we have NATO, and NATO will always be, as a military alliance, a bridge between the European countries and the United States and Canada. That is, I think, not a discussion, but I think even NATO allows for a independent European defense and will make NATO much stronger. And when it comes to ensuring the democratic, the democracy and democratic decision-making within Europe, I think the European Union cannot guarantee this. This is not a fully fledged democratic organization. A federation can, and by implementing a federation as an organizational solution to all these challenges, we safeguard our democratic procedures, we safeguard a better relationship with the US within NATO, and we have what you could call strategic autonomy, that we are not dependent on the US for support. I think in general, a federation will be a solution for many challenges and problems that we need to face in the future, and will make us stronger and makes us, Europe, a better and stronger player within the global system, which has its own challenges, of which I already mentioned climate change, which needs a global approach to solve these problems. So there are a lot of challenges, and by combining our forces, we can be, as Europe, a force for change that is able to safeguard its own values and interest. I think that is hopefully the answer to the question.
Okay, thank you. So it will be, according to you, like kind of another European branch of NATO.
Perdona, Iván, perdona un momento. ¿Puedes traducir lo que ha comentado
comentaba Ingo que bueno, él piensa que es posible realizar una nueva integración europea basada en el federalismo, teniendo en cuenta que muchos estados son parte de la OTAN, que esos puentes que existen entre Europa, Estados Unidos y Canadá para esta alianza en la defensa no se verían, digamos, amenazados por un proceso de construcción federalista en Europa, que al contrario esto reforzaría, digamos, la autonomía de los estados europeos a nivel posiblemente estratégico para afianzarse en este nuevo orden mundial donde, como él antes ha comentado, hay temas que son globales como el cambio climático y que ahora mismo no tienen una posición común en Europa en sí. Yo simplemente quería repreguntar si él se está refiriendo entonces a que sería posible tener una especie de departamento europeo de la OTAN y va un poco a incidir en cuáles serán entonces esas relaciones con Rusia una vez acabe la actual guerra en Ucrania. I just wanted to come up with the question. I just got the point you mentioned that it will be possible to keep this alliance within the military agreements of the NATO. I understand that will mean that we will have kind of a branch or a European branch of the NATO to aligning these forces, which could be perfectly parallel to a democratic process towards federalism in Europe. My question is how this will come into the relations with Russia, because at the end, yeah, it's kind of this idea of the big Europe or the axis between Paris, Berlin, Moscow, that at the moment is completely broken. Could be this affected by the way of generating this dependency, or even if Europe goes into a more federal state, how these relationships with Russia will come in the future?
Yeah, I think the problem with the war in Ukraine, there are many problems with this war, obviously, but one of the problems of this war is, and that's related to this question, is that we frame it as a war with Russia, which it obviously is in some respects. But is this not a war with Putin, or is this a war with Russia? And that is a little bit the point. I think that we should realize that Russia is part of Europe in some respects and is physically close to what you could call Europe. And I think we should try to achieve that in the future, Europe has a constructive and positive relationship with Russia. We have now this war, which is basically a Putin war, where he uses Russia to fight Europe and the United States. But our perspective must be more inclusive, that we realize that there is obviously a Russia after Putin, and we hope it's a Russia that is more focused on Europe and European values. But we should keep on trying to develop on the longer term and give that perspective to Russia now, to the Russian population, that we want Russia to be part of at least close to Europe because we share these values. And it is a little bit strange and a missed opportunity that through Putin and the way we frame this war ourselves and the Americans, we push Russia towards China. That is not in our interest. That are not the core values of the population, the biggest part of the population in Russia. So on the longer term, we should try to achieve a positive, constructive relationship with Russia, and that should be our aim in this war. There is a Russia closely related to Europe after Putin, and we should frame it in that way, that there is an opportunity for the Russian people as well to become part of Europe after this war. I think that should be that's a more positive, a more inclusive perspective that is in the end more in the interest of the European countries, of which is Russia in some respects an integral part.
Sí, bueno, la respuesta de Ingo va en la dirección de que al largo término será posible tener en cuenta el hecho de que Rusia es importante para Europa, que estamos creando el marco erróneo en esta guerra de que Rusia es Putin y digamos que van separados. Él habla de un escenario en el que en algún momento Putin no estará más, digamos, en la posición de líder de Rusia y esto proporcionará que Europa pueda acercarse más hacia Rusia, que es al final una frontera natural integrada en Europa, para primero solucionar esta guerra, por supuesto, y luego crear un espacio de prosperidad. Además, comenta que uno de los errores quizás geopolíticamente que Europa tiene que evitar es empujar a Rusia hacia China, pero que como ha comentado, lo que nos referíamos, es necesario olvidarse del marco que se ha creado en esta guerra, donde se identifican a Rusia y a Putin, digamos, en el mismo bando, y pensar que en un futuro esto no será así.
Rusia, Putin.
Y se posibilitarán nuevas, mejores relaciones con Rusia, seguro, de las que existen ahora.
Sí, bueno, hemos centrado bastante la discusión con el problema entre Rusia y Ucrania, que es lógico por la presente situación. Pero yo quiero hacer la siguiente pregunta a Ingo. Si la adopción de una defensa común en una futura Federación Europea es fundamental, como bien has explicado en tu presentación, ¿cómo crees que debería organizarse la defensa federal europea? ¿Con una cuota fija de miembros por cada uno de los países integrantes o como un ejército construido basado en la capacidad de los candidatos independientemente de la nacionalidad? ¿Y debería ser un ejército con capacidad ofensiva o solamente defensiva? Ingo, I translate this for you. If the adoption of a common defense in a future European Federation is fundamental, critical, as you have already explained in your presentation, how do you think the European federal defense should be organized? With a fixed quota of members for each of the member states, or as an army built based on the capability of the candidates, regardless of the nationality? And should it be an army with offensive or only defensive capacity?
Yeah, first of all, the discussion between defensive, offensive is always a little bit problematic from a military point of view. What is the same weapons that are used in a defense can be used in an offense? Of course, there are typically offensive weapons, but that mix is, from that military technical perspective, a little bit not as clear as it sounds. So I think that currently, it's not about Europe and Russia at the moment. The big thing and contest in the back is the rivalry between China and the United States. That is the main conflict that will define where the UN 2.0, how it will look. And for now, the focus is on Europe and Ukraine, and the US and China are supporting this each in their way. But I think in the end, it is about the contest between the US and China. So this can change quite quickly. I think that we should be able to have strategic autonomy. Europe has no intentions to go to China. America maybe has. We will not. Maybe we will participate in the defense of Taiwan if it comes to a confrontation over there, but that is not a significant contribution. Europe is focused on the continent here in Europe, and I think we should have some offensive capabilities to be of help to our partners worldwide. So yes, we should have some offensive capabilities, and we should organize this European defense around a system that there is one point in Europe where decisions are made about foreign policy and about defense and how to commit this defense organization. And member states of the federation contribute automatically, are part of this bigger organization. And that means that it is decided in Brussels where this army will go, and that is ensured that through the federation, this is a process under democratic control. So, which is not the case now. So to answer your question, I think we should have some offensive capabilities. We must be able to safeguard, also from a military point of view, that we have global interests that we can protect. We must realize with our combined economic power, we are a global player, and that as Europe, we have an interest in a functioning global system, and that the United Nations 2.0 is an organization that supports democratic values and supports free trade within the world, as the United Nations did in the past. So yes, we need to have a presence militarily in the world, but we should be realistic. And in the end, we should aim for maybe even, that is far away, a global federation, that a UN 2.0 is really a democratically organized organization as Europe should be. Then we are becoming a world, a global system that is democratic at heart, and that we are focusing our energy on matters that matter, and that is, first of all, to not start fighting with each other now and then again, but that we focus on climate change and develop the world in a fair way and fight poverty in the world. I think that should be our aim, and that should be the aim of the European Federation as well on the longer term. Long answer. I hope I made myself a little bit where this should go, in my opinion.
That's fine. Thank you, Ingo. Ivan, can you translate to the Spanish audience?
Sí, bueno, ha habido varios puntos en la respuesta. Comienza diciendo que al final no hay una gran diferencia entre armas ofensivas y defensivas desde un punto de vista militar. Esto significa que, bueno, Europa tiene que mantener la posibilidad de colaborar con sus aliados a nivel exterior en lo que sería la utilización de armas ofensivas y, a su vez, ser capaz de crear un escudo, me entiendo, de armas defensivas para proteger el espacio europeo. Ahora mismo la intención de Europa no es combatir a China, posiblemente sí lo sea la de Estados Unidos. Esto Europa tiene que tenerlo en cuenta. Y en última instancia comentaba que para asegurar ese orden mundial sería a largo plazo interesante pensar en una federación a nivel global donde todos estos riesgos se puedan de alguna manera diluir y se puedan usar, digamos, se pueda difuminar, digamos, la diferencia entre armas ofensivas y defensivas, porque haya, digamos, un acuerdo más a nivel global que impida esto, ¿no? Pero bueno, la idea principal creo que era que es difícil trazar la línea entre armas ofensivas o defensivas. Europa debe de participar en el exterior. En caso de que haya un enfrentamiento con China en Taiwán, posiblemente ahí Europa ha entendido que tendrá que usar armas ofensivas, pero que, bueno, a su vez tendrá que asegurar la defensa del territorio.
Muy bien, gracias, Iván. Ingo, en tu presentación has mencionado la ineficiencia de la ONU y la necesidad de su reestructuración. ¿Cuál es tu opinión sobre cuáles deberían ser las líneas esenciales sobre las que se debería construir la ONU 2.0 que mencionas? In your presentation, you mentioned the inefficiency of the UN and the needs for its restructure. What is your opinion on what should be the essential lines on which the UN 2.0 you mentioned should be built?
On what should... Can you repeat the last sentence?
Yeah. What is your opinion on what should be the essential lines on which the UN 2.0 should be built?
I think at the heart of the UN 2.0 should be always are the values that underpin this organization. When you read the United Nations Charter from 1945, it establishes certain principles that very much favor democracy. It basically promotes democracy to a certain extent, and it safeguards our values. You can rightly say so, that the United Nations, the outcome of the Second World War, can be defined as a Pax Americana in the sense that typically American and Western values are supported. That is democracy, that is free trade. This outcome of the war is not automatic. That was not automatic. You should realize what I mentioned, that there is a natural growth process of social structures and nations in Europe and in the world, and that in 1500 we had hundreds small political units. 1939 it were only 25 states, and now we are almost there, that we have a sort of European federation as the next level of organization. And I think that we should realize that in the Second World War, European unison could have achieved as a fascist European state or as a communist European state if, for example, the landings in Normandy had failed, or the Americans had decided not to come to support Europe in its efforts to stop the Germans. So this outcome that Europe is democratic is not automatic. It also means that in the next big change to a UN 2.0, it is not automatic that the values will underpin the UN 2.0 will be democratic values or will support free global trade. So in other words, this systematic crisis, this redefining of the United Nations is of very much importance of our ability to safeguard our principles, our values, and our interests. And I think when we go to the next level, we should ensure that a United Nations 2.0 is much more democratic, much more democratic organization. For example, what is wrong with the UN is that we have 5 permanent members, that includes the UK and France. But where is India in this respect, with 1.4 billion people? They are not represented, and this shows how outdated the UN now is, and that at its heart, it's promoting democracy by its members, the West and the US, but at its heart, the United Nations is far away from a democratic organized organization or a representative organization. When we go to the UN 2.0, this issue must be addressed. Not only the idea that we have member states with veto power who basically decide how the world works. That is not a good system. It's not democratic. And we must ensure that countries like India are fully involved in the governance of the global system. Otherwise, we can never solve the big problems we are confronting related to climate change, for example. So I think that is what we should aim for and look at. And if we are now in this contest, and as you probably read yourself lately in various news outlets, China and Russia are just saying we are fighting for a new international order. They already made clear what they're fighting for. The only thing we as the West do is following the Americans who are fighting to maintain this current system that isn't working anymore. And the problem with the UN is it cannot reorganize itself from the inside, because every permanent member, like the UK and France, all of them have a veto power, so there will never be any significant change taking place. So that's what I actually want to say is, if we want to have an attractive narrative, not only in Europe, but for the whole global population, what we are trying to achieve as Europe, that is that we are basically trying to establish, and that's the context we must have with China and Russia, a more democratic and maybe even a global federation at that level, to ensure that humanity and the people in the world actually are represented in a fair way at this governance structure. And I think that is important for a UN 2.0 to keep in mind what we are trying to do on the very long term. And I think we promote our own interests to promote democracy as a basic principle for the next charter of a UN 2.0.
Thank you, Ingo. Can you translate, Ivan? No, we cannot hear you. No te podemos escuchar, Iván.
Perdón.
Ahora sí.
Sí, no, decía que la idea que comentaba Ingo es que estas Naciones Unidas 2.0, bueno, empezaba hablando un poco de la historia, de dónde viene, digamos, el actual orden mundial, que se crea a raíz de 1945 en el contexto de guerra, con una Pax Americana que tiene la democracia y al comercio libre internacional como pilares fundamentales. Que estos pilares fundamentales no vienen dados, no están asegurados. Ya en la Segunda Guerra Mundial Europa estuvo, digamos, entre regímenes fascistas o comunistas. Finalmente se alcanzó este acuerdo a nivel global. Esto no quiere decir que Naciones Unidas no necesite profundizar en procesos democráticos. Ha puesto el ejemplo de cómo funciona el actual Consejo de Seguridad, donde hay solamente 5 países, con Reino Unido, Francia, pero con la ausencia clamorosa de la India, con el volumen tan importante de población que tiene, y que, bueno, en integrar a nuevos países en este nuevo orden que pueda existir en estas nuevas Naciones Unidas 2.0 debe ser una prioridad para alcanzar a largo plazo una federación global que pueda, digamos, solucionar muchos de los problemas que existen a nivel de participación y de democracia en Naciones Unidas, y ir hacia unas Naciones Unidas 2.0 que integren mejor y que, digamos, profundicen en reformas democráticas.
Bueno, yo quería, buenas noches, perdonen que interrumpa, pero quería también, no sé si están haciendo preguntas de los que están viéndonos, de la audiencia.
Sí, no hay ninguna pregunta que venga en estos momentos de la audiencia.
Todavía estoy escuchando y yo tengo un par de preguntillas, pero bueno.
Sí, no,
Sí, adelante,
las 10:06. Cuéntame, Xavi.
Vale, yo creo que el compañero lo ha dejado muy claro. O sea, creo que lo ha dejado de los últimos programas, lo ha dejado muy claro. Y mi pregunta sería, ¿de qué manera sería, ¿no? En la Unión Europea digamos, la idea de estar en la OTAN o no estar en la OTAN?
Yeah, the question.
Dentro de la federación, digo, dentro de la federación, porque ya lo hablamos el otro día, dentro de la federación de Europa, ¿cuál sería?
Sí, yo creo que esta pregunta ya la ha contestado antes, Xavi. Que el desarrollo de la defensa de la Unión Europea sería una progresión con las estructuras actuales de la OTAN. Sí.
Sí, pero como al compañero no lo escuché la semana pasada, es una pregunta, la pregunta que hice la semana pasada. ¿Cuál sería la relación, digo nuevamente, con Rusia, China y Estados Unidos? Porque el otro día escuchamos a otro compañero y me gustaría saber si la opinión.
Bueno, él ya ha contestado cuál debería ser la relación de la Federación Europea con respecto a China y a Rusia. Sin embargo, no lo ha hecho con Estados Unidos. Déjame que le haga esta pregunta porque yo creo que es muy pertinente, Xavi. Ingo, given the possibility of progress towards a multilateral planet, as opposed to the current unilateral one dominated by the US, could it end up in a confrontation between Europe and the US?
Yeah, I understand your questions. We don't have the same interests. I think our shared values and interests are so much entangled and the same that I don't think that is possible. And no, I don't think that is realistic. That we don't, and in some respects, do not have the same interest. That must be clear too, and we must be able to move forward in some respects with some strategic autonomy. But I do not think that this can end up as a real confrontation between the US and Europe. I don't think that is realistic. We have too many shared values, but on the other hand, we have different values and interests. And I hope that with the relationships we have with the United States, we can handle them within a proper political process and within the different decision-making or organization like NATO we have. You must realize too that the US needs Europe also. That's the other side of it. That's why they keep us dependent from them to be able to tell Europe what to do, not only from a military perspective. Maybe they're not happy that we cannot fully support and take care of ourselves regarding Russia, regarding aggression from Russia in Ukraine. On the other hand, it's an opportunity for the US to play a global political game because they can tell Europe what to do. For example, that in this case, a Dutch chip maker, ASML, is not allowed to send its products to China anymore. And that is part of the chip war the US started against China to isolate China from this type of technology. And that is the game the US can play with us because of our dependencies. And that is in some respects not in our interest as Europe or whatever. So I think there are differences of opinion, different interests. And in the end, we will have a more healthy relationship with the US when we become more independent and have the opportunity to take our own course of action. That gives us the leverage over the US.
Sí.
Vale, la segunda pregunta que tenía me la has respondido ya, con lo cual yo ya no tengo más preguntas. Ha sido un placer y creo que me ha quedado muy claro de las preguntas que tenía que hacer y las dudas que tenía, pues me ha quedado clarísimo. Por mi parte, nos vemos la semana que viene.
Muy bien.
Y eso.
Gracias, Xavi. Gracias. Tenemos una pregunta también de Javier Giner. ¿Quieres hacerla directamente, Javier? Porque tú te puedes comunicar perfectamente.
Con mucho gusto. Buenas noches y bien, hoy he llegado tarde al programa, pero he llegado a tiempo porque tengo una pregunta muy importante que me lleva rodando por la cabeza desde que se inició la Convención Ciudadana. Y la pregunta concreta es si sería conveniente que los Estados Federados de Europa fueran neutrales en el futuro, por si podría contribuir mejor a la paz mundial.
Yeah, Ingo, Javier is asking whether the federal states of Europe should be a neutral federation. I think you already answered this partially early on in the debate before Javier entered the discussion. But nonetheless, if you want to add anything else, that's fine.
So you asking me if the federation should be a neutral organization? Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the point is a little bit this with the word neutral. What does it exactly mean, and in what respect, and in what relationship? I think,
like Switzerland.
Yeah, I think with this neutrality of Switzerland comes in some respects a sort of isolation as well, and not a fully involvement, maybe in some respects, what is happening in the world. I think I will give the example of the Netherlands, and that is the same with Europe in general. For its prosperity, the Netherlands is highly dependent on a functioning global system based on free trade without limitations, and that there are regulations that we can deal with everybody in the world. I think talking about neutrality in the 21st century, where European countries and Europe as such is part of an integral network of economic relationships and dependencies, I think the word neutral is a little bit problematic for me. I think as Europe, we should be actively engaged in a global system and be able to promote our democratic values and where we stand for as Europe, and promote our interests. Because if we do not actively take care of this, other countries will contest or will start discussing the value of them, as China and Russia are doing now. So I think we should be engaged based on these principles, with this responsibility that these principles we promote brings for us. And that is one thing. So neutral, that means also that in certain respects we must have a point of view and be prepared to act outside Europe in whatever respects. And the other thing is, Switzerland can only be neutral because it's at the heart of Europe, and basically we are taking care in that respect for Switzerland, who can sit back and leave these matters, which are basically the same, they share the same ideas with the rest of Europe. We are taking care of them. So their neutrality is based on a high degree on the presence of Europe and the way it's acting in the world. And I think we cannot afford ourselves to be neutral as Switzerland is in Europe in a new global system where we are all dependent on each other. And I think we must be able to shape this system and the way it works as well. And climate change is a big issue. That means that there will be a lot of decisions coming our way, how to deal with things. Choices must be made that are very painful, that will bring a lot of tension, but we have the responsibility to take part in this process, not only ensure our own interest, but it's our interest that at the global level, we live in a world that is peaceful, where other people are happy, and that we can promote from our perspective their interests as well. And that makes us very powerful and attractive as a federal Europe to show who we are and where we are fighting for, so to speak. That is a little bit my perspective. So neutral as Switzerland is, I think that is not realistic, and it is not what we should try to achieve. We should have our presence at the global stage.
Thank you.
Muy bien. Bueno, me dicen que ya son pasa de la hora y 10 minutos, que nos queda muy poco tiempo. Yo quería hacer una última pregunta y pediría también brevedad en la respuesta. Ingo, con tu experiencia única en la guerra de los Balcanes, ¿qué sugerencias darías a los dirigentes políticos para acabar con la presente guerra en Ucrania? I translate, with your unique experience in the Balkan War, what kind of suggestions would you give to the political leadership to end the current war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that I have an uncomfortable feeling. So I took part in a fighting unit that was formed together with the United Kingdom and France in May 1945, when finally these European countries, including the Netherlands, decided that we should basically act in Bosnia. And that became what they called the Rapid Reaction Force. Participating were France, the UK, and the Netherlands. And myself, I was in the military at the time, was very uncomfortable for years actually to see all these this news coming from the Balkan, Bosnia. And we always said in Europe after the Second World War, referring to what happened in Europe in the Second World War, this should never happen again. But basically, from my perspective at the time, it was happening again. And let's be honest, it was quite close by. It was in Europe, and we were just spectators in this war. There were principles at stake, and finally, it was decided, and I could participate with my unit in this war. This happened, and this uncomfortable feeling where I see the Ukraine fighting Russia, basically also for our values and for our interests, gives me an uncomfortable feeling because we are not doing enough. The question is, how can this war end? It doesn't seem that it can end through negotiations, because for Putin, everything is at stake. And basically, by together with China saying this is about the international order and much more about Ukraine, Putin cannot lose this war anymore. He will keep on fighting. So the question is there a political solution through negotiations on the short term? I don't think so. From the perspective of the Ukraine, the point of view is the same, and maybe there's some influence from Europe and the US to steer Ukraine to a sort of solution that the US wants. But I think the point here is we must support the Ukraine more strongly in this war. So how can this end and how should it end? I think our commitment must be more than it is now. NATO can do more than it is doing now. This war becomes a struggle, a very long-term struggle, because we are afraid to do an intervention. And I understand this is a very complicated question because there's a risk of escalation, but to end this war, possibly we should do more, faster, and not wait and sit back and see how the Ukrainian people are fighting for its values, and we give them just enough weapons that the Russians do not win. That's a different perspective. Do we want Russia not to win, or do we want the Ukraine to win? That is a little bit a very basic issue. And do we allow in Europe that Russia takes territory from another country and then sit back and say, okay, let's forget this? No, I think we must get more engaged in this war. That's a little bit my perspective, because I don't see Putin saying suddenly, okay, I made a mistake, let's discuss this, you can keep, I will pull back. Then it's his end of his political life and probably of his life in Russia. So this will not happen. This is Putin's war. And that is a game we must play smarter to make this clear to everybody. So yeah, I do not know if I give an answer to your question. It's complicated, but my ground idea is to get more involved, stronger as Europe to take our responsibility. In the end, Russia will back off, and China is reluctant to give full support to Russia, and that is a leverage we can use.
Certainly, it's a complex question, but I think you answered this perfectly well, Ingo. Can you translate even in 30 seconds, because we are short of time now?
Bueno, realmente la idea que comentaba Ingo es que él piensa que hace falta involucrarse más en esta guerra, apoyar a Ucrania en esa defensa de los valores europeos, que no se está haciendo quizás lo suficiente. Y que, bueno, quizás esto viene también motivado porque en Europa no existe, digamos, esa fuerza común para entrar en ese conflicto. Él no ve una solución a corto plazo, tampoco una mesa de negociación. ¿Cómo acabará esto? Bueno, supongo que nos queda todavía guerra para rato, desgraciadamente, y habrá que esperar a cómo se desarrollan los acontecimientos.
Bien, pues aquí cerramos esta interesantísima conferencia y queremos dar las gracias al doctor Pipes por su generosidad de compartir con nosotros sus conocimientos y opiniones. También gracias a todos los asistentes y al Círculo TV. Here we close this very interesting conference, and we want to thank Dr. Pipes for his generosity in sharing with us his knowledge and opinions. Also, many thanks to all attendees and the Círculo TV. Nada más por hoy. Felices Pascuas a todos ustedes. We close here and wish you all a happy Easter. Goodbye, everyone. Bye, Ingo.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Adiós.
Gracias.
Chao.